Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sohara. I'm a freelance journalist. My work focuses on climate change environmental issues. So today, as you all know, is a very important event about 100% renewables for 1.5 degrees. And today I have with me a very special guest. I have Tzeporah Berman, who is the global ambassador for the 100% renewable campaign. Tzeporah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So to start things off, I was wondering if you could give sort of a layman's overview of what this event is and what people should expect from it.
Well, you know, this is actually an incredibly important event to be having here at COP22 because while there's really amazing momentum on renewables around the world, and especially commitments on 100% renewables, we have now 14 countries that have committed to go 100% renewable. We have 300 cities, 80 major corporations, and thousands of small cooperatives all over the world. So the momentum is really growing. We now know we have the technology. The price of renewables is dropping. Yet we know that the world is getting hotter, that the commitments here by national governments are, while a breakthrough, I think, in Paris, insufficient to meet our goals of achieving 1.5. But, I would say one other reason why this event is critical is that our government's all committed to two things. They committed to the Paris Agreement, but they also committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that means energy access for all within a decade. And the amazing thing that we're seeing as renewable energy is adopted around the world is that we can meet both of those goals. Renewable energy systems are more diverse, they're more distributed, they're more equitable. And they are now inexpensive for remote communities who have never, the billions of people who have no energy access, to get clean, safe energy.
That's fantastic, and actually that brings to a lot of the things we on all of our minds. One of the issues or one of the points used against renewable energy usually is that the argument that it's expensive or not as cost effective as other forms of existing energy. So I was wondering if you could help dispel that myth.
Yeah, that may have been true a decade ago, but we have seen more changes in and advancements in technology for renewable energy in the past 5 years than we did in the last 20. And the result of both the changes in technology as well as the adoption of renewable energy policies around the world means that the price of renewables is just dropping really fast. So, for example, the price of solar, the price of wind, down 60, 80% just in the last 4 years. And so now what we're seeing in many countries is that renewable energy is actually cheaper than fossil fuel energy. But the other reason we often see that fossil fuel energy is still advocated, coal, oil, and gas for our energy systems, is because our governments are subsidizing fossil fuel energy, billions and billions of dollars every year. So if you take those subsidies away, which of course G20 countries, for example, have committed to do but haven't, then there's no question that renewable energy can compete at scale.
That's a very good point you brought up about the subsidies. So in terms of COP22 or any international climate negotiations, this happens to be one of the major points that keep coming up about these subsidies that are artificially sort of decreasing the price of other forms of energy. So what can we do, or what are your expectations from this climate negotiation in terms of maybe reducing those subsidies?
Well, we're increasingly seeing discussions about the subsidies. Really, that needs to happen at home. We need to have, civil society encouraging our governments to take action to reduce those subsidies. And what can happen here at COP, I think tonight is the beginning of it. Tonight is the first time that we see the COP presidency, we see the climate vulnerable nations, all non-state actors who participate in these international discussions coming together to support the vision and the fact that 100% renewable is happening right now. Even 2 years ago, I would say that people didn't talk about 100% renewable at a COP. It was seen as not viable. But now when you have so many examples around the world of countries who are developing those pathways of, of entire cities that are going 100% renewable, we know it's viable. So, I think what really needs to happen is that, as the Paris Agreement is entering force, national governments are invited to communicate by 2020 their mid-century strategies. And those are to phase out GHG emissions. But the fact is, this can only mean developing a 100% renewable strategy. We can't say that we're going to decarbonize this century to keep the world well below 2 degrees with an ambition of 1.5 without creating 100% renewable pathways. And so that's what we're doing tonight, is creating that conversation about how we encourage national governments within the international process to create a 100% renewable pathway.
Absolutely. I think that's very important to have that conversation going right now before the Paris momentum is, I guess, lost or sort of slows down. So to be on a positive note, I think that's very important. You talked about some nations that have already shown that this is possible, or they're doing good work in the field of renewable energy. So I was wondering if you could give a few examples of where it has worked, a few nations or cities where we see success stories of renewable energy.
Sure. Well, let me talk about my home, because that's always fun. I'm from Vancouver. The city of Vancouver has committed to going 100% renewable. And it's amazing to me living there, the changes we're seeing in the city every day. Because of the commitment, because of the support from the municipal government. They started by leading by example. So municipal procurement, municipal buildings. But simultaneously, our sub-regional government, our provincial government, also has introduced in 2008 a carbon tax. Mm-hmm. So when you start pricing pollution, people start realizing that there's a benefit to moving towards renewable sources. And it also means that there's certainty for the business environment to start to innovate. And we're seeing an influx of high-tech and clean tech into the city. We're seeing big institutions like the hospitals and the University of British Columbia, for example, moving to renewable energy. So that's in Vancouver, but that's just one example. I mean, if you look around the world, Sydney, Copenhagen. Tonight we'll hear about an entire island, Sumba, off the coast of Indonesia. And Sumba is a fascinating example because what's happening there is the entire island has committed to 100% renewable. And it is a coalition between the government, corporations, and local communities. And the renewable energy systems are distributed. They're run by the communities through cooperatives. And so that doesn't, renewables aren't a one-size-fit-all. So we're seeing many different systems. Wind, micro, hydro, solar, changing the face of an entire island.
Yeah, that's actually something that everyone can take something away from. Even countries that so far have said that maybe it's not their responsibility, which keeps coming up, especially developing nations, which, for example, to give the example of my country, I'm from Bangladesh, and while our government, our Prime Minister has won many Champions of the Earth award, she's going ahead and building coal-fired power plants in a UNESCO World Heritage Site, like a mangrove forest. And that sort of thing keeps happening because of the argument that keeps coming up that millions of people in these nations are without access to energy, and coal is cheap, or it's the viable, available option. So for countries like that, for countries that are developing and have these huge energy needs, how do you think an example like that you mentioned of Vancouver could be replicated, or what can they do to sort of transition to cleaner energy?
Well, really, the first and most important thing for a national government to do is to commit to 100% renewable energy and then start creating that pathway. And the fact is there's enormous pressure from the energy incumbents, from the coal companies, from the oil and gas companies. I think of it as the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. They know that the world is changing. They know that in the climate era, we're going to need to move very quickly away from fossil fuels. And they want to get the infrastructure built now so that we continue to depend on those fossil fuels. But when you look at the economics of building renewables, for example, over that coal plant, often the argument is made that renewables are too expensive. But what we need to realize is that the renewables are a one-time payout. So the sun and the wind is free once you have that system put in place. And so, but a coal plant, your nation will be dependent on continuing to buy that coal and continuing to address the pollution impacts and the health impacts of burning that coal. So there is no question that renewable energy is much cheaper. But what the big energy incumbents don't like about it is that they don't own it. Renewable energy by its nature is diverse and distributed, which often means that the big utility model and the big energy company model doesn't exist in the future. And so that's why we see that struggle and that reticence to adopt renewable energy.
Right. I think that's a very valid point. And one of the things, like, it keeps coming back to financing. And in this climate talks this year, we've seen a lot of talk about like leveraging private finance, getting innovative financing. Do you think that could apply to renewable energy as well?
No question. And in some of the case studies that we'll hear tonight, we are seeing some really innovative financing models. We're seeing support, of course, from governments. Like any technology, the critics of renewable energy like to say, well, it's only viable if it's subsidized. Well, first of all, fossil fuel subsidies are 6 times that of renewables, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance Analysis. But also, there is no new technology in history that governments haven't played a role in helping kickstart. There's a great story about the iPhone. And we think of it as, this amazing innovation from this company, Apple. But when you look through the history of that technology, all of the different components were supported at various times by governments incenting the beginning of new technologies, new destabilizing high technologies. And so governments will play a role. I think what's very clear in this setting, in COP22, is we need developed nations to step up to the plate and ensure equitable financing for the climate fund in order to support emerging economies leapfrogging over the fossil fuel era and being able to have the capacity to invest in renewable energy. And that's certainly something that I'm encouraging my own government, Canada, to do. And I hope we see some serious commitments on financing coming out of COP22.
Absolutely. And speaking of financing, like everyone's talking about the Green Climate Fund these days. It's like the big sort of source of finance, and it has pledged to allocate 50% to mitigation, 50% to adaptation. But a complaint that keeps coming up from developing nations that need access to funds is like it's too difficult, it's too bureaucratic, and maybe they don't have the technical capacity to go through or fulfill the criteria you need to actually be eligible to get funding from that fund. And that slows down the process significantly. So what do you think going ahead a focus could be, or what steps could be taken to maybe overcome some of those barriers for these countries?
Well, we need to do everything we can to ensure the capacity for those countries to engage and to have access to those funds. And honestly, we need to listen to the Climate Vulnerable Forum and other leaders, like the leaders who are developing proposals through the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, etc., to say what they need. We need to respect those leaders and respect their needs and do everything we can to support emerging economies.
Speaking of respect, actually, I think one question on everyone's mind is how much will the new U.S. presidency respect the climate agreement, and what would the steps be going ahead? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, whether or not President-elect Trump supports the climate agreement, I think, given his previous statements on climate change, we don't hold out a lot of hope. I don't hold out a lot of hope. However, what we know about the move towards renewable energy right now is that it's unstoppable. Bloomberg New Energy Finance reports that for the past 3 years, every year, we've had more investment in renewable energy than an investment in oil, coal, and nuclear combined. You know, make no mistake about it, whether or not President-elect Trump likes it or not, the world is moving to 100% renewables. The technology is there, the financing is beginning to be there, and no single president could have stopped the move from landlines to cell phones, from horse and cart to cars. We are living the moment where we are seeing a revolution in industry. We're living the tipping point moment where we will re-envision our energy systems. And that movement, especially given the commitments from big players like China, it's already happening. And I think we're going to see a lot of other countries step up and take a leadership role if the U.S. decides to step back. But, you know, President-elect Trump is a businessman, so maybe he'll see the advantage.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of encouraging renewable energy diversification or increase of use is about increasing investment in renewable energy. So especially in developing countries, how do you think countries like the LDCs could encourage more investment, could encourage private sector to maybe invest more in developing green energy?
What the private sector is looking for is certainty.
Right.
Regardless of the region that they are operating in. And in fact, what we see is the private sector is drawn to countries where they have long-term certainty. And that's why we're having a discussion tonight about nation states committing to 100% renewable, creating those pathways as part of their commitments to decarbonization. And when they do that, we see a surge in investment and finance in those countries. Because, you know, if you're a big company that is going to not only put up wind turbines, but actually manufacture those wind turbines in that country so that you have even more jobs from renewable energy, what you're going to be looking for is whether or not you have policy certainty in that country. Because we don't build plants, we don't build energy infrastructure just for today. We build it for tomorrow. And so that's why those companies are going to be looking to see, you know, am I going to be seeing an increase in renewable energy policies over time? Is there a commitment and a pathway, targeted percentages that countries want to move to? I know from my own experience in Canada, when the Ontario government passed the Green Energy Act, committing to scale up renewable energy, to support renewable energy in the province, we saw a number of companies, big companies, moving into Ontario because they could see that there was a benefit there. So that's, you know, there is always an interplay between policy and finance. But regardless of the jurisdiction you're working in, those companies are going to be looking for that policy certainty, a commitment to renewable energy over the long term, so they can bring in the finance and build that infrastructure.
Right. And I think Canada, you mentioned, is actually a very interesting case because you have a very dynamic leader who everyone loves and is sort of an advocate for green energy and this, climate change movements. But at the same time, it's an economy that's fundamentally dependent on oil, like fossil fuels. So that's a disconnect right there. So going ahead, how do you think the country can maybe move towards a greener future?
Well, we're starting to see that. I mean, we had in Canada what I call the lost decade. We had a prime minister and a majority government federally that didn't believe in climate policy, and so we're trying to catch up. We're very lucky right now, and that we have elected a government that believes strongly in climate action, that played a leadership role in Paris, and I believe will play a leadership role here in Marrakesh. And so we're on the cusp of a new national climate plan. The Canadian government will announce a new national climate plan in December. And what we know so far is that they have already committed to a price on carbon nationally. So at the point that you have an entire country pricing pollution, that begins to provide that certainty we were talking about for the investment community on the move to renewables. It's not easy. for fossil fuel exporting jurisdictions, whether or not you live in a developed country or an emerging economy, to move away from fossil fuels, to diversify our economies. But we know in the climate era that that's what we have to do, and we have to do it quickly. And so I'm hopeful that this government will not only commit to the price on carbon, but will commit to an ambitious renewable energy agenda as well, and energy efficiency agenda. And I know from the Alberta minister here, Minister of Environment, Minister Phillips, this morning, was talking about the importance of diversifying the economy. So Alberta can see competitive advantage in other parts of the economy and not just be so dependent on oil. It won't happen overnight, but it's going to happen.
So for the less, I guess, climate change jargon savvy of us, I was wondering if you could maybe explain a bit more about, you said about putting a price on carbon, for instance. So how would that work at a national government level?
Well, it's really actually not that complicated. We make it seem really complicated, and there's a lot of, certainly the devil is in the details. But ultimately what we need to do is simply put a price on pollution. So that can happen through a carbon tax, which is the route that our government in Canada is going. It can happen through a cap and trade program or a cap and auction program. In Canada, it's quite complex because we have a confederation. Energy is the jurisdiction of the provinces. So we have our own mini negotiations going on in the country. But our government has committed to try and create a level playing field and is encouraging sub-regional governments, the provincial governments, to step up and put their own price on pollution, which basically means that there is a price for every ton of emissions. So if you are producing and responsible for a ton of carbon, then you have to pay a price. That money then goes back to the provincial government, and different provincial governments are making different decisions about how to use that. From the perspective of the Renewable Energy Campaign, I would say that it's absolutely critical that when governments take that step to put a price on pollution, whether it's through a carbon tax or any other mechanism, that money then be used for the solutions, to support the development of renewable energy, of livable transportation systems, energy efficiency and retrofitting. That is, we need to have that money that comes from pricing the bad stuff go towards the good stuff.
Sounds great. So we've talked about the different elements of renewable energy and about the global 100% renewable energy campaign in general. So to conclude, I'd say, in one line, how would you summarize this campaign? What would make it effective? What do you look forward to?
This is not just a campaign. It's a growing movement of cities, of corporations, of countries committing to 100% renewable energy in order to meet our commitments of keeping a climate-safe world, a 1.5 world, and to ensure energy access for all. It's happening now. We're going to see a lot of examples of that tonight. Our goal is to encourage other countries to step up and make that commitment to 100% renewables.
Great. Thank you so much, Tzeporah. That was very enlightening for me and many of us here as well, I believe. At this point, we'd like to open it up for questions from the panel, if there are any. Please show of hand, and we can go ahead with that. Yes, please. Right, so the question is, how can people follow the event if they're not there in person?
That's a great question. So this evening, the event will be Facebook live streamed on the CAN International Facebook page. And you can also follow the Twitter feed and engage in the Twitter feed at #Go100RE.
Yes, please.
I know it's a very complex question, but you mentioned that renewables are free, and we have companies who clearly care about energy not being free because they own so much of fossil fuels, and they care about not moving away from that. So how do we work all together to change that and convince businesses especially to move towards renewables, and how do we change that mindset?
Increasingly, we're seeing businesses move towards 100% RE because it makes financial sense for them. As the price of renewables drops, we're actually seeing a huge shift in the corporate sector very quickly. And I think the leadership that we're seeing from companies like Mars and IKEA, who we'll hear from tonight, is really going to inspire other companies to do that. How can we encourage governments, considering the pressure from fossil fuel incumbents? I think what's really important to understand is that we have the technology, and what we need now is the political leadership. So our governments will take that step and make that commitment if they hear from us, if they hear from their constituents, from civil society, and if more and more organizations start speaking out on the need for governments to commit to 100% renewable. It's like any other political issue. Our governments need to know that we'll support them when they take that difficult step, when they make difficult choices that might be controversial, and that if they don't, there will be consequences.
Any further questions? Okay. Going once, going twice. Guess, yeah, I think that's all. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.